Chapter 52. Stony-faced, Will watched the new arrivals approaching from the southwest. They marched in a large, irregular gaggle, and the weak mid-morning sun glinted off their weapons and armor. At least 300 of them, he thought. Holt's voice snapped him out of his grim reverie. "You'd better get moving if you're going to reorganize your troops," he said. "Or do you plan to surrender?" Will shook himself angrily and ran down from the slightly elevated spot where Holt and Shigeru stood. He sent a detail to recover as many of the javelins as possible, and ordered the wolves and sharks forward into the front line, replacing the two badly depleted Gojus who had borne the brunt of the fighting so far. Horace and Selethen would command the two new Gojus in the front line. The three friends had a hurried consultation. "They won't have any rams this time," Will said, "so I guess it's business as usual. Use your javelins. 2 volleys each, no need to save them for stabbing. And close with them as soon as you can. Our men did well when they got in close, and the Senshi don't like it." His two commanders nodded. Horace glanced to where Shigeru stood, in full ceremonial armor. "Any chance you can convince Shigeru to get away?" he said, lowering his voice. Will shook his head. "Holt tried. He'll stand by his men, win or lose." "I always thought he would," Selethen said quietly. All of the foreigners had come to respect the strength of character and the quiet dignity of the Emperor. "In that case, we'll just have to win," Horace said. But the very fact that he'd asked the question showed that he didn't believe that was possible now. They all knew their best chance had been to smash Arasaka's force before Yamada's men arrived. That opportunity was gone. They could hear the irregular tramp of feet and rattle of equipment from Yamada's force as it drew closer. In a few minutes, they'd be fighting for their lives again. "All right," said Will. "I guess this is it. Time we—" "Chocho! Chocho-san!" The clear young voice carried to them, and they all turned to see Mikaru running towards them. The tube of darts slung across his back slapped up and down as he ran, setting up a rattling counterpoint to the thud of his feet. "What is this Chocho business?" Will muttered to himself. But his friends overheard the comment. "It's a term of great respect," they chorused, and he glared at them. "Oh, shut up," he said. But now Mikaru had drawn up with them. He leaned forward, regaining his breath, heaving in deep lungfuls of air, his hands on his thighs. "Mikaru, we're going to need you back with your men," Will began. The small but potent force of dartmen was stationed on the far side of the line. But Mikaru was shaking his head as he gathered enough breath to speak. "Chocho!" he managed to gasp. "There are men coming! Soldiers!" "We know," Horace said, jerking a thumb at the approaching Senshi. "Be a bit hard to miss them." But Mikaru waved his hands in a negative gesture. "Not there," he said. "There!" And he pointed to the east. 3 sets of eyes snapped around to follow his pointing finger. To the east of their position, past the end of the left flank and the low cliff, lay another ridgeline, 2 kilometers away. Emerging from behind it and onto the plain was a huge body of troops. As the 3 friends watched, the column kept streaming out from behind the ridge, dust clouds rising to mark their movement. "It's the girls," Horace said quietly. "They made it, and they brought the Hisanu with them." "There must be thousands of them," Selethen said, as the column continued to emerge into sight. And now they could hear the faint sound of a distant chant. Will realized they could hear it because the cheering from Arasaka's army had died away as all eyes turned to the east. "Kotai! Kotai! Kotai!" "What are they saying?" he asked Mikaru. The young fighter grinned at him. "They are saying, 'Emperor! Emperor! Emperor!'" he told them. Will let go a huge sigh of relief. He glanced round to where Holt stood and saw his old teacher, his cowl pulled back and his head bared, nod quietly to him. The Hisanu had deployed fully onto the plain, and they began to advance towards Arasaka's senshi. The chant grew louder and louder as they approached, and Arasaka's men turned uncertainly to face the oncoming horde. Even with Yamada's men, they were outnumbered at least 3-1, and they watched apprehensively as they began to make out details of the Hisanu. Huge figures, over 2 meters in height, covered in what appeared to be long reddish hair and brandishing spiked clubs, pikes, and heavy spears. Unconsciously, the senshi grouped closer together as they faced this terrifying new threat. And as they did so, they seemed to forget that behind them were the deadly fangs of the wolves and the sharks. Will glanced at the 2 Goju, in perfect, disciplined formation. He realized that this was the ideal opportunity to smash Arasaka's army. His small but highly trained force would be the hammer. The huge Hisanu army would be the anvil upon which they broke Arasaka once and for all. "Mikaru," he said, "get your men to advance as far as the hedgehogs. Hit the senshi from the flank. Let them have all your darts, then run for it." The young man nodded and sprinted away. Will turned to Horace and Celathan. "Advance all 4 Goju and hit them in the rear," he said. The 2 commanders nodded and ran to their positions. Orders rang out. There was the familiar crashing sound of the massive shields being raised into position, then the wolves and sharks stepped out in perfect unison. The depleted Gojus of bears and hawks formed up behind them. Some of Arasaka's men sensed their approach and turned to face them. The rebel army were trapped. The wings of the massive Hisanu line would encircle them within the next few minutes. And the grim-faced Kikori fighting machine was in their rear. But the senshi were warriors and trained in a hard school. They might have no chance, but they would sell their lives dearly. Those at the rear turned to face the steadily advancing Kikori Gojus. 40 meters out, Horace called for the Kikori to halt, then for the rear ranks to open out, their javelins poised. "Stop!" The voice, deep and resonant, rang out over the battlefield. Will spun round and saw Shigeru, with Holt beside him, striding towards the Kikori line. After a moment's hesitation, the young ranger moved to join them. Shigeru was holding a green branch above his head, the Nihon-Ja equivalent of a flag of truce. A hush had fallen over the battlefield as thousands of warriors waited to see what was about to transpire. The green branch was an inviolable symbol and must be respected. Holt, Will, and Shigeru strode across the plain until they stood between the Kikori Gojus and the senshi line. Shigeru stopped, still holding the green branch high above his head. From the Hisanu force, they saw another group of figures, also bearing a green branch, detach from the main group and begin to move to join them. Will's heart surged with relief as he recognized Alice, with Evelyn beside her, trying to match the taller girl's long strides and still retain her dignity. They were walking a pace or 2 behind a tall, aristocratic-looking Nihon-Ja in warrior's armor. As they drew closer, Will met Alice's eyes, and they smiled at each other. "Lord Nimatsu," Shigeru said, "it's good to see you." The tall Nihon-Ja bowed deeply. "I am at your service, Your Excellency, as are my people. Give the order." Shigeru said nothing for the moment. He turned to the rebel forces, now barely 50 meters away from him. "Arasaka," he called, "we have to talk." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a movement ripped through the rebel ranks, and the Senshi warriors parted as a group of 3 men moved among them. Arasaka, his face hidden by the almost demonic-looking red lacquered helmet, and 2 others. They stopped. On Arasaka's right was one of his lieutenants, a stocky Senshi nobleman bearing a huge recurve bow. On the left was an older nobleman, also in armor. Shigeru bowed to this last person. "Lord Yamada, do you recognize me?" The older man peered at the figure before him. He wasn't sure. His eyes weren't as good as they used to be, and the person was some distance away. But he definitely looked like the Emperor. "I was told an impostor had taken the Emperor's place," he said, his voice uncertain. Suddenly, the bowman on Arasaka's right moved, drawing back an arrow he had already fitted to the string. "Death to the impostor!" he screamed as he shot. Shigeru stood, unflinching, as the arrow pierced his left upper arm below the protective armor. Blood began to stream down over his white linen sleeve. A roar of protest rose around the battleground, from friend and foe alike. The green branch of truce was sacrosanct. To breach it was an abomination in the eyes of the Nihon-Jan. But before anyone else could move, or the bowman could prepare another shot, Will whipped an arrow from his quiver, nocked, drew, sighted, and released in one movement. His arrow punched through the nobleman's armor like a hot knife through butter. The man staggered under the impact, his recurve bow falling from dead hands. Then he crumpled to the ground. The crowd grew suddenly silent, stunned by Will's lightning reply to the treacherous attack. Voices started to murmur again, uncertainly at first. But again, Shigeru stilled the crowd. Quickly, he took a scarf from around his neck and knotted it around the wound in his arm. Then he put his uninjured hand on Will's bow and took it from the young ranger. His voice rang out once more. "Enough! Enough bloodshed! Lord Arasaka, let's end this now!" Arasaka's sword hissed from its scabbard. Once more, a murmur of strong disapproval rippled across the plain, both from his own men and his enemies. To draw a weapon in the presence of the green branch was a gross breach of the Senshi code of behavior. Even Arasaka's troops could not condone such an action. "This will only end with your death, Shigeru!" Arasaka screamed. Yamada turned to him, the anger and shame he felt all too obvious on his face. "Shigeru?" he repeated. "Then you've known all along that this is no impostor. You lied to me and my men." Arasaka, furious beyond reason, tore the helmet and facepiece from his head and hurled them to the ground in rage. "He's weak, Yamada, weak and dangerous. He will destroy everything that we hold sacred." He glared now at Shigeru, his face flushed, his eyes blazing with hate. "You want to destroy the Senshi class and everything it stands for. I will not allow you. I will stop you." "Arasaka." Shigeru's deep voice was calm and reasonable by contrast. "I will not destroy the Senshi. I am a Senshi. But for too long, the other people of Nihon-Ja have been repressed and downtrodden. I want to rule for all people. Like the Kikori here and the Hasanu. The ordinary people have the right to have a say in our country. Tell your men to lay down their weapons now, and let's live in peace. Let's live together in peace." "No!" Arasaka's voice was a shriek. "My men will fight you. We will die if necessary. You may defeat us, but this will not be a cheap victory. Thousands will die here today." That's something I cannot allow, Shigeru said. Arasaka laughed, a shrill sound that showed how close he was to snapping. And how will you stop it? He demanded. I will stand down, Shigeru said simply. Arasaka recoiled in surprise, and exclamations of amazement went through the crowd. I will abdicate if that is the only way to stop this madness. Appoint another emperor, Shigeru continued. Lord Yamada and Lord Nimatsu. I look to you to ensure that a proper choice is made. But I will not stand and watch thousands of Nihon-Jan, my people, lose their lives to preserve my pride. I will stand down. You're bluffing, Shigeru, Arasaka said. You won't give up the throne. I swear that I will, if that will prevent thousands dying here today. Shigeru let his gaze run round the faces of Arasaka's men as they watched this clash of personalities. I swear on my honor, before all of you here. Silence greeted his words as those watching realized that he was in earnest. Then Yamada's men began to mutter among themselves. They had come here under a false belief. They realized now that Arasaka had lied to their commander to make them break their oath to the rightful emperor. If Arasaka ordered them to fight, their commander would refuse, and so would they. Now Arasaka could depend only on his own men. Matsuda Sato was a low-ranked officer in Arasaka's army. He commanded a small group of 12 men and had led them in the service of his lord for 17 years. In all that time, he had received scant recognition for his service or his loyalty. He had watched Arasaka brutalize his men, driving them mercilessly and punishing them severely if he believed they had failed him. Arasaka never rewarded good service, only punished that which he deemed to be bad. Sato, knowing no alternative, had always assumed this was the sign of a strong leader. Now he realized he was witnessing real strength. A man who would forsake the highest position in the land to save the lives of his subjects. This was leadership, Sato realized. This was a man to follow. Arasaka was exposed as a deceiver and an oath-breaker. Sato slid his katana, still in its scabbard, from inside his belt and dropped it to the ground in a sign of peace. Shigeru! He shouted, raising his clenched fist above his head. The men around him looked at him in surprise. Then one of them copied his actions and joined him. Then another. Then 2 more. Then a dozen. Shigeru! The cry began to spread throughout Arasaka's men. The rattle of swords hitting the ground became continuous, like some monster hailstorm, and the voices swelled, another dozen, then 50, then 100, then more. Shigeru! 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 Then the Kikori joined in, letting their shields and javelins fall to the ground and adding their voices to the swelling roar of acclamation. And finally, the deep-throated Hisanu as well, till the mountains around them rang with the name. Shigeru! 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 Wild-eyed, furious, goaded beyond reason, Arasaka swung his gaze around his followers. The chanting was now deafening, and the sight of his own men cheering the emperor was too much. His sword flashed, and the man nearest him fell with a cry. Matsuda Sato, commander of 12 men, looked up at his former lord, puzzled and wondering why he was seeing him only through a red haze. He felt numb where Arasaka's sword had opened the massive wound in his chest. Then the red changed slowly to black. A horrified silence spread over the plain as men realized what Arasaka had done. He stepped forward and turned to face his troops, hurling abuse at them as they instinctively stepped back away from him. "You have betrayed me," he screamed. "You have shamed me. You defile my honor." "You have no honor." He spun round, the blood-stained katana still in his hand. The speaker, whose words had carried clearly to the men around him, was one of the foreigners. A young man wearing a strange green and grey cloak. Arasaka's eyes narrowed. This was the one who had shot so quickly in reply to his lieutenant's arrow. But now the foreigner's heavy longbow was in Shigeru's hands, and he was unarmed. "You are a traitor and a coward, and a man without honor, Arasaka," the foreigner continued. Arasaka raised his katana, pointing it at the calm young face. "Who are you, Gajin? What do you know about honor?" "I'm called Chocho," Will said. "I've seen honor among these Kikori warriors, men I've trained to fight you. They are men who understand loyalty and trust. And I see it now in your own men, now that they recognize the true Emperor of Nihon-Ja. But I see no honor in you, Arasaka. I see a crawling, cowardly, lying traitor. I see a man with no honor at all." "Chocho!" Arasaka shouted, goaded beyond control. "Butterfly? Then die, Butterfly!" He leaped forward, the katana rising for a lethal strike at the unarmed foreigner. But then Will's right arm shot forward from beneath his cloak, and he stepped forward with his right leg, going into a crouch as he released the sax knife in an underarm throw. A spinning pinwheel of light, it flashed towards the charging Arasaka, hitting him above the breastplate of his armor, below his chin, and burying itself in his throat. The impact of the heavy blade jerked Arasaka's head back. He felt the katana drop from his suddenly slack fingers, felt hot blood gushing from the huge wound. Then he felt nothing. Will straightened from his crouch as Shigeru stepped forward and laid a hand on his shoulder. "It seems he mistook a butterfly for a wasp," the Emperor said.